This is me. I was born in River Forest. I grew up here. I went to Fenwick. I moved away from River Forest in the mid-90s, and I was gone for about 15, 20 years. During that time, I was a farmer, and I'll talk through that. I live in Galewood now. I garden quite a lot on multiple different spots. I also help people with their own gardens. I am with a group called the Austin Green Team. I have a property in the Austin neighborhood and became affiliated. One of our Austin Green Team members, Donna, is here. And the Austin Green Team is an urban agriculture group on the west side of Chicago that for the past 30 years has been at least 20 has been taking blighted properties in the Austin neighborhood and converting them into these beautiful gardens. And they have multiple properties in the Austin neighborhood where they have movies in the park, where they have volunteer crews and kids groups that come and learn how to garden during the course of the growing season. So the Austin Green Team is kind of a powerhouse of a community group in the Austin neighborhood. My life as a farmer, is anyone here familiar with CSA growing? Basically subscription produce, where people would pay me in the beginning of the season and I would bring them bags of produce every week until Thanksgiving. I did that for a number of years, and I also supplied produce to restaurants and grocery stores. All of the produce I grew, the whole time I was growing it, I used organic methods. I wasn't big on pesticides or doing anything because I was growing on my own property, so it was very important to me to leave my property every year better than I started the year before. So with the Austin Green Team, it's a very important community group in the Austin neighborhood, trying to just increase the community involvement in beautifying the Austin neighborhood. I do also have another business called The Backyard Farmer, where I actually help people if they have a backyard or a space of their own that they would like to be gardening for food. I can show them how to do that, whether that's building raised beds, whether that is taking their existing space and making it that they can grow produce there. But even that business, it's kind of like what I'm saying. My whole point is to make gardening easy for people, and I enjoy doing that. So let's start off with the green thumb myth. I've heard this my entire life, where someone does or does not have a green thumb, which I think is horrible, and I don't think that's in the least bit true. I'm a suburb kid who grew up at Lake and Jackson in River Forest, and I didn't really know a heck of a lot about gardening. But I read a lot, and I talked to people, and I learned. I think anybody can learn how to garden. Anyone specifically can learn how to container garden. But there are some rules that aren't bendable. And so once you know a couple little rules with container gardening, you could grow in raised beds. You can grow in very small containers. And I'll go through this with you. So starting off with container gardening, what is it and who is it for? And it's the process of growing a plant in a restricted space. That's it. That's container gardening. Whether you have a raised bed that is 10 feet by 20 feet or you have a 5-gallon bucket, it's the same rules. So we'll talk through those rules and you'll see how easily they apply across the spectrum of the size of container that you're growing out of. So that's a container. And whether you're growing in a pair of boots or a raised bed, it's the same thing. So container gardening is for anyone who has limited space. That limited space could be by choice, or it could mean that you live in an apartment. But whatever it is, you don't have, when I was farming, I had 8 acres. I had the biggest garden I'd ever seen. But gardening rules still apply. So in growing in containers, whether you have a windowsill in your apartment or you have a space in your backyard, the same rules will apply. So it's the worst answer to any question, but I have to start somewhere. So what it depends on, is what's an ideal container. Starts off with what is your available space? What is your available sunlight? And what do you want to eat? So if you can answer these 3 questions, then you're off to the races. So An ideal container could be Dixie cups, which is how most kids start gardening. It could be a coffee can. It could be a 5-gallon bucket where people grow tomatoes in. People do all of this all the time. It also could be old furniture. It could be a beautiful window box inside your house. It could be one of these raised beds that the Deep Roots Project constructs, but it's going to still be the same rules. Whoop, I'm sorry. Okay. Are raised beds different? As opposed to, are they different than, say, containers or a coffee can or a 5-gallon bucket? Absolutely not. They're all the same. You're growing a plant in a restricted space. Does that make sense to everybody? Cool. Okay, so let's talk about the pillars of container gardening. These are the unbendable rules when you're growing in a restricted space. You have to think about the nutrition of the plant. You have to think about the sunlight. You have to think about your water. And you have to be aware of what your pests are. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. And like I said, if anybody has any questions, I really want to talk through it with you. So nutrition. The biggest thing about nutrition for your container garden is you do not want to use your garden soil. And if I'm going too fast, someone just yell, slow down please, and I will. But you don't want to use garden soil in a container or a raised bed. Can anyone, throw a guess out as to why? Please.
Are you talking about garden soil out in the backyard?
You would not want to take the soil from your backyard and use it to grow in a pot or in a bucket or any type of container.
Are you talking because of the lead content and other heavy metal content?
Some people may have that issue, but that's not the primary reason. But I mean, that's a good answer, for a lot of us who live on the west side of Chicago. That's a real concern, and so you wouldn't necessarily want to be using that. You don't want to use your garden soil, number one, because it drains poorly. So Chicago soil in particular doesn't have a very high sand content. And so what happens is you get the rainwater in there and it stays right there on the surface and effectively, kind of drowns your plants or, produces an ideal spot for mold, but it drains poorly. So that's the number one reason you don't use garden soil. Number two, can anyone tell me how long weed seeds stay in the soil? 50 years. So there are weed seeds in your soil that are 50 years old, and when the soil's disturbed and those weed seeds feel the sunlight, they're going to grow. So if you're starting off with a container, you don't want to start off with a bucket full of weed seeds because you've just disturbed all of those seeds. Now they're going to get the sunlight and they're going to grow. Third reason is mold or disease, but I kind of like to think of it as kind of just a soil-borne disease. If you have garden soil that's been there for years, there could be fungus, there could be molds, there could be anything in your soil that just may not get you off on the right foot in your container. So if you're starting with a container garden, start fresh. Don't start off fighting old problems. And that's just my thought on that. So keeping on the subject of nutrition, what you do want to use is a potting mix that's specific for gardens or raised beds. And what this means, so, in technical growing world, they call potting mix a soil-less mix, or they'll just call it growing media. But what they don't call it is dirt, because it's not dirt. The bulk of it may be crushed coconut hulls, or it may be some type of organic matter that that drains really well, and then they add to that. They may add compost. They may add some type of nutrient where the plant can actually grow well in it, and the potting mix will retain water. But there's no dirt content in it, which makes your life a lot easier because it'll actually drain well. So there are no weed seeds in potting mix, so that's a hurdle you don't have to overcome when you're container growing. Potting mix is built to drain. When you water it, the water naturally will move from the top to the bottom. And potting mix, when you get it, is generally kind of pre-packed with nutrition, whether that's, from compost that's been added or, this Miracle Grow potting mix. They'll have all types of artificial supplements in there, but it still does have nutrition in it. So the second pillar that I would want to talk about is sunlight. Obviously, 8 hours of sunlight is great, but that's an ideal world, and I don't know of a lot of places in Oak Park with the tree cover that we have where you have 8 hours of full sunlight. So might as well start at the best and work your way down, but with regard to thinking about your sunlight, think first about what it is that you like to eat. And then we can kind of work backwards from there. Work backwards to, well, what does that plant need? How much space do you have? And can the container be moved? And that's kind of a big point. There are raised beds that are on wheels. Maybe you get morning sun in one spot and 10 feet away you get the afternoon sun. Well, it might be nice a couple days out of the week to go ahead and get a full day of sun for your garden. So here are a couple ideas on movable containers. You have a tomato plant in a bucket. You have a movable raised bed. Here you have someone who's actually grown salad in a container. But what they're all able to do is track the sun and use it because their raised bed or their container is not necessarily anchored in the same spot. So is your container portable? You can watch how the sun hits your property and you can track it. And you can follow the sun with your container. Does that make sense to everyone for how you can max out your sunlight? Obviously, if you do have a good spot in your yard or on your property where you do get the bulk of the sunlight of the day, having a portable container isn't that important. But not everybody has that, and a lot of people who are here for container gardening may not.